Feel the weaving of a theme through these passages, and perhaps this is a theme that will touch you this morning. When your foes are hungry, feed them. When they are thirsty, give them water to drink. In this way, you heap live coals on their heads, and the Holy One will reward you. You're familiar with the old written law, love your friend, and its unwritten companion, hate your enemy. I'm challenging that. I'm telling you to love your enemies. Let them bring out the best in you, not the worst. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the energies of prayer, for then you are working out of your true selves, your God-created selves. This is what God does. God gives God's best, the sun to warm and the rain to nourish, to everyone regardless, the good and bad, the nice and nasty. If all you do is love the lovable, do you expect a bonus? Anybody can do that. If you simply say hello to those who greet you, do you expect a medal? Any run-of-the-mill sinner does that. To you who hear me, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. God, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is error, the truth. Where there is doubt, the faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Spirit, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Good morning. You did not want me to come up and sing, I promise. I turned off the mic so you could not hear that. So, St. Andrews, it is always a pleasure to be here with you. And I appreciate you all letting me use the music stand for my podium, because that's too far back from you, right? Yes, yeah. Indeed. So I am getting myself centered. I had the opportunity over the last week to do something I've never done in my almost 60 years on the planet. I got to go on a road trip with one of my good friends to Santa Fe, to one of my favorite places. And so we came in back on Friday night, and I'm still at the altitude of Taos or Santa Fe or something. So if I sound a little strange to you today, it's like she's still in Santa Fe. But thank you so much, because this is a gift. It's a gift to get to come back from Austin and to come into this space and this place. And so as we talk this morning about inclusive love for healing and transformation, I want to talk a little bit about something that's kind of been bugging me. So I tend to write sermons for myself. And if you want to ride with me, that's fine. But this is kind of a sermon. I've noticed over the last couple of years with our political times that the whole idea of inclusive love is kind of, it's been brought out, in terms of us helping the poor and the marginalized. It was mentioned this morning about the children that are being torn away from their families, right? And there's an outpouring for the marginalized. Indigenous people. As I said, when we were in Santa Fe, we saw the most beautiful things and the most heart-crushing things about the culture that's being destroyed in Santa Fe. The indigenous cultures remind us of the colonizing, dominating, the power and the force that destroyed culture. But then we were there as beneficiaries, and we got to walk the streets of Santa Fe. So there's this double-edged sword that we see sometimes, and we see people in power do some things that make us very angry. And a lot of times people in power don't get a lot of love. You at St. Andrews use the inclusive Bible because there's inclusive language, the invisible. And sometimes the people in power are sometimes invisible and don't get a lot of inclusive love from us. So part of what I want to talk about today is inclusive love for people in power, for the people we don't like very much. And I'm talking about the politicians that you don't like, the politicians that I don't always like, the tyrant, the Klansman, the homophobe, the bully, the misogynist, people that we might consider enemies for the most part. And it's interesting because the enemy can run the gamut from being a childhood bully, could be somebody you just don't like their taste in clothes. You think, oh my goodness, I don't like the way she talks or he does this. And those people are seen as kind of oppositional. But the real bullies, the ones, your trolls on social media, right? Some of you have bullies on social media. But the thing about bullies that we're going to talk about today, or the enemies that we're going to talk about today, is they have power. And there are two things they have. They have power and they have the ability to invoke fear. And they may be afraid of you too. And so sometimes if those enemies have some kind of physical or political power, we think it's okay to make fun of them. We think it's okay if somebody has power or money and they're doing awful things for us to say whatever we want to say about them personally. We would never do that to an immigrant child. We would never do that to the marginalized, but we will do to people we perceive have power. We'll say and do things about them that we would never do to the marginalized. And I want you to think about that for a minute. I want you to think about on the political stage, maybe in your workplace, maybe your supervisor, maybe somebody, that it's okay to trash them. It's okay to make jokes about them. And it happens, it's probably happening in churches as we speak, right? Because it's okay, because they have power and we don't. They're good, they're bad, and we're good. And so I want you to think about when Jesus was born, first century prophet, right? We followed Jesus. We followed the teachings of Christ. And I think one of the hardest teachings he has is to love your enemies. I don't even know how anybody followed Jesus after he said that. It's because during that time, Jewish people had been colonized, dominated, destroyed, executed. And then you have this first century prophet who shows up and says, love these people. I'd been gone. I don't think I could take that in. So Jesus was born in enemy territory, right? He was born through no fault of his own. He winds up in a place where his people and he are hated. So this first century prophet shows up and says, hey, you've got to love these people. And some people followed that and some people didn't. And today it's really hard. You could probably do a roll call of people you couldn't follow. I mean, you just can't love them. You might say a prayer for them for a minute, but you're just like, I really can't love that person. And so that's a big problem of us who call ourselves Christians and call ourselves followers of Christ. And so I speak to myself in this regard because it is really tough to watch brutality, to see what's happening all over our country. And so this loving of enemies, and many Christians, we love everybody. We love everybody who's on the margin. We love trees, right? Some of us are vegetarians because we don't want to harm the animals. Some of us drive funny cars because Mother Nature is so important. But we don't like people. And we make jokes about them. and they're fodder for Saturday Night Live. And they're memes, right? Those little funny cartoons that we make about people. But yet we're Christians and we say we're inclusive with our love. We have inclusive Bibles, we have inclusive language, but some people are not included because they're too bad to be included. So, like millions of people of color in this country, I was born in enemy territory too. I was born in far northeast Texas in 1958. I came into an America that was dominating, colonizing, separated, and hate-filled. As a kid, I didn't pick my enemies. I was an enemy of many white people in northeast Texas, innocently, and many millions of black and brown children who were born in this country come into enemy territory. And America still has its hate and its separation, and there are people who have political power and force. And again, I come into the world enemy, grandmother, Choctaw, other grandma of African descent. I come in with triple oppression, some people might say. Native American, African, and female. And I will add poverty to that as well. And somehow, I'm supposed to love the white people who are benefiting from a system that works for them but doesn't work for me. Born in enemy territory. Some of you are not born in enemy territory. You showed up into a space and place that was built for you. And you can walk this world not having to be too upset with anybody. Because if the system doesn't work for you, you can just go demand that it work for you. And so those of us who are born in enemy territory have to really take that Christian message to the next level, or we walk around very bitter. I have had a glorious 60 years. But had I taken in the bitterness and decided that all white people were enemy, I would be in a lot of trouble. And so being born into enemy territory is sometimes quite a spiritual gift. It can be very much a spiritual gift. And so questions I had to ask myself at a very young age is, how can I have inclusive love for people who gentrify colonized land? Everywhere I look, I see land. It's very seldom, and I have a different kind of lens. I always want to know whose land was this before I was on it? Whose land was this before you were on it? Then how can I have inclusive love for white people who get rich off of the prison industrial system? How do I have love for people who know that they're enslaving people? How can I have love for ICE agents and business owners who exploit and terrorize immigrants? And I can give inclusive love when I'm in my spiritually right mind, because I've experienced inclusive love. And you can always tell people who've experienced inclusive love because it comes from a spiritual space. It doesn't come from being accepted or belonging to the dominant culture. And there's no recipe for it. I always tell people I'm speechless in trying to describe what it feels like to be connected to something way bigger than yourself. So if you look at your circumstances, you would give up. And I told you 4 oppressions I was born into, right? 4 oppressions I was born into. I could have just said, oh my gosh, I can't make it. This world wasn't made for me. But I experienced something on a spiritual level that keeps me moving. The other piece of it is that in order for me, and in order for all of us who follow Christ, we've got to be living the mercy, love, grace, and forgiveness that Christ talks about. It's something about walking that out. And none of us is perfect, right? None of us is perfect. We have our days. I have my days where I call it spiritual amnesia. And then I have days where I willfully, like, no, I can't love him. I can't love him. He's not worthy. And then I have to go back and think about some of the things that I've done. And a lot of times we think, oh, well, you know, this person's awful. He has power. He's misusing his power. The thing about our enemies that we have a hard time praying for is this, is that their lives are on stage in full regalia, right? We get to see their misuses of power and their abuse. My misuses of power and your misuses of power aren't on Fox or MSNBC, right? When you abuse power as a parent, when you abuse power as a supervisor, when you abuse power in any way, it's not on television. And most of the time, the abuse of power comes from being unconscious. Unconsciousness is the enemy. And so we've all been unconscious, and we've all abused whatever power we have in whatever segment. So one of my favorite writers says, the role of the artist is exactly the same as the role of the lover. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And so when we really love people, we have to make them conscious of what they can't see. And part of the way that we do inclusive love, sometimes you can feel inclusive love, and some of you who know what I'm talking about, is sometimes it comes in silence. Sometimes it comes in prayer, in meditation, in laughter, in relationship. But you become conscious of yourself as an instrument of love. And it just shows up. You can't conjure it up. It just shows up. And so those of us who follow Christ, we have to remember that we are those instruments. And when we see all this evil, we want to fix that person, that person, that person. And then it's like it comes right back down here. What am I going to do? So if I'm practicing and living inclusive love, and inclusive love is healing and it's transforming. It changes evil. Somebody ought to be changed, and they ought to be different from being in your presence. All of us have different roles in this. Some people teach, preach. Some people just live their lives. I have beautiful friends, black women friends, white women friends. They live their lives in such a way that they transform whatever they come into the presence of. They don't even have to open their mouths. And if you're a follower of Christ, something ought to change just because you showed up. If you're living if you're living life like this, nothing may change. Nothing may change at all. And when we think of inclusive love, you have to think of yourself as included in that love that you're trying to demonstrate. It's got to be lived. It can't just be talked about. And one thing changes when you're conscious and you're in your right mind is you stop seeing he hates me or he's just this. You start to see a spiritual dis-ease. So when somebody's mentally ill, we have a way of treating people with mental illness, do we not? There's certain care we take with people who have mental illness. We don't think about people in power who are misusing power as spiritually diseased. They have no spiritual connection. You can't separate babies from their mamas if you've got a spiritual connection. You can't enslave people. You can't shoot them down in the street when they're running away if you've got a spiritual connection. And so when we start to look at people who have power and force, we have to start to say, there's a spiritual dis-ease there. And when we look at mentally ill people, people who are struggling, we have empathy and compassion in ways that we don't have for people in power. So you all know, and you chuckled earlier when I talked about it, you know these things that we see on TV and on social media, right? We distort things about people. Sometimes we call it satire. That lets us be sophisticated and talk about our enemy, right? We call it comedy. We call it gossip. We call it righteous indignation. And we might even get confused and label our personal derision of other people as some kind of prophetic tradition. There's nothing in the prophetic tradition that allows you to personally ridicule people just because they have power. And it's really hard because you're thinking, something needs to happen different. Yeah, love needs to happen different. So when I'm engaged in this, what happens is I fall into the very culture that I'm trying not to be a part of, the dog-eat-dog culture, the same culture that creates hierarchy and decides who's worthy of love and who's not. So as a Christian, I can decide you're not worthy of love. And so when I start to make fun of you, I'm a part of that. That also lets me be a perpetual victim, lets me be powerless. And so I can just do a like, right, on the social media. I got off of Facebook a while back. Don't y'all still have likes and thumbs up? Somebody tell me. Okay. So you see something that's funny and hysterical about a politician you hate or somebody you don't like, you get to give it a thumbs up. But that's not love. And it may make you think you've done something by agreeing with the person who wrote or sent whatever they sent. And so it allows you to continue to be powerless and justify it. So inclusive love, and get this, inclusive love does not mean that you just ignore the oppression. That's not the point. You have to speak the truth of the conditions that are being created by your enemy. If your enemies are creating, just like the protests, all those things are ways to make people conscious of what it is they can't see. Photography, art, all those things are ways for people to see what they can't see. It's amazing in this time of social media when people can do videos of the police chasing people down and shooting them in the back. That's making people conscious. That's making some of the heartbreaking pictures of the babies without their parents. That's making people conscious of what it is they can't see. So if I'm experiencing inclusive love and I'm practicing it, it's transforming me the whole time. So this whole thing about inclusive love is not like an event. And now you have your license in inclusive love, right? I did that. I'm done. It's a day-to-day struggle because things show up to tell you not to love. And so you've got to be transformed every day that you're walking, because without inclusive love, you become what you despise. You can actually wind up becoming what you despise by ridiculing those in power. And the easiest way to do it, like I said, is watch television. Last night I was watching television with my friend, and I was watching a movie probably for the second time about Sarah Palin. Y'all know this thing, Game Change. I heard somebody kind of snort. I'd seen it. And there's a part in this movie, if you haven't seen it, see it. Definitely see it. I wouldn't actually encourage that otherwise, but I thought it was enlightening because it told me something about me as I was watching it again. Watched it with my daughter-in-law a couple of months ago. And there's a part in that movie where you actually have this deep empathy for Sarah Palin, because you see her humanity. She sees the people ridiculing her on TV, making fun of her, right? And I love the scenes where she's seeing this, hearing it. And, you know, and Tina Fey is dressed up like her. And I mean, at the time, I thought it was funny, you know, when it was happening. But to see her seeing herself being ridiculed was really, really deep into sadness in me about, wow, this lady, even though she appeared to have power and this ability, she is a human being. She was a human being and is a human being. And then later in the movie, she gets full of herself. And she gets so arrogant, she's just, you know, telling everybody off. And then I found my empathy just disappear. I was like, what kind of love is that, Stephanie Hawley? It's like, here I have empathy. Oh, she gets arrogant, so now I have no empathy. That's not inclusive love. And I started thinking about, why is it that somebody else's behavior changes my love for them? It shouldn't. It definitely shouldn't. But because she has power and appears to have power and a platform, well, she got what she deserved. And this is sometimes the way we think God is going to get people back, the people we don't like. And that's not at all the way it goes. And so some of you may have heard this term. I'm looking at y'all to see what the average age is here. The term stay woke. Have you heard this term? Oh, yeah, good. I like this. Lots of gray-haired people saying stay woke. You know what that means. And staying woke, for those of you who are like, I'm really not sure, but I'm going to laugh anyway. Staying woke really is about remaining conscious of whatever oppression is going on, and then what is your role in acting against that oppression. And so staying woke as a follower of Christ for me is to consistently be mindful that the end game is love, that the end game is unity. That's the end game. So I don't want to destroy the people that are oppressing me. I want to transform myself so I can help transform them. So we want to get to the finish line together. I may not like you today, but tomorrow you may flip. You may not like me, and then I become conscious, and I start to change the way I do my walk. And so the idea is not to destroy the enemy. The idea is to transform ourselves and transform the enemy at the same time. Because after a while, you'll find that you really don't have any enemies. And then there are the internal enemies that we have that have power over us as well. That's another sermon. So how do you get to this place of unity? Is what you, when you're staying woke, you're saying, I'm getting to love. How am I getting to love? How am I getting to unity? How am I getting to wholeness? How am I getting there? And that's with the grace, mercy, and forgiveness. And you always packing that license for grace, mercy, and forgiveness. Always, always. No matter how much power people have. And it's a constant process. So, like the psalmist, and I'm sure you guys have asked yourself this question too. How long does evil persist? How long is evil going to last? And I think about, there are detention halls and youth centers right now that are full of black and brown children. Some of them that shouldn't be there. Should not be there. There are prisons full of black and brown people. And as you all know, there are children without their parents. All that's evil to me. And I wonder how long it's going to persist. Gun violence, police shootings, all those things. We can make the list. Institutional racism, we can make the list and get overwhelmed. And I think that evil will persist until we all get conscious and practice inclusive love for the enemy. Because the people that are doing these things are lacking love. And you got it. You're packing love. You're packing it. I'm packing it. You're packing it. But if we decide we're not going to put it out there, then we've got people who are stuck. And so I might utter a prayer for my enemy and my family or something. And then if I turn around and I utter the prayer and say, Lord, please forgive them, please transform their hearts. And then I turn around and I'm watching Saturday Night Live and I'm laughing. You've got this. You've got this dichotomy that's going on, this double-minded that's going on. So at some point we have to decide, am I going to walk this inclusive walk? And today I might. And then I will have to get still enough to understand that I'm in the flow. I'm in the inescapable flow of grace. And I got to get close enough to other people who are not conscious that they too are in the inescapable flow of grace. So, as I close, if you were born into enemy territory, like I was, like millions and millions of people are, if you were born without race privilege, without socioeconomic privilege, without gender privilege, if you might be a born healer, because you can see stuff nobody else can see. You've experienced things that nobody else can experience. You may be a born healer. And if you weren't born in enemy territory, you might just be a born lover. Like James Baldwin said to us, if I really love you, I'm going to make you see the things you're not conscious of. So just because you weren't born in enemy territory doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to heal the world. Because you too can see things. And if you're a follower of Christ, you can see things that nobody else can see. Whether you are black, white, or brown. Following Christ, you can see things that other people can't see. We live in a world that has a winner-take-all mentality. We live in a very fearful world. That's why we separate and do what we're doing. But people who follow Christ, you know that we are only as well as the sickest person in our society. That's how well we are. And so that means none of us are well. And if you were born and you're walking with that Christ light, I encourage you to go out and do the healing. It may be speaking, it just may be present. So in your bulletin, we have St. Francis's prayer, St. Francis of Assisi. And as I close today, I'd like for us to read that together. And because that prayer, and as I told you when I was in Santa Fe, I got to go see the big statue in front of one of the cathedrals. And I saw this prayer, and I said, those are the directions for a healer. It tells you what is broken, and it also tells you what needs to be healed. And so if we could read this together, we're going to read this together, and I'm going to take my seat and just give you some time to reflect on what the mission is as you leave and go into your week. So, prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. Let's read together. It's in your bulletin. God, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is error, the truth. Where there is doubt, the faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Spirit, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.